Morning, everybody. Welcome to the Prison Leavers Innovation Challenge Evaluation and Criteria webinar. My name is Sarah Wilson, and I'm the Policy Lead at the Ministry of Justice for the Innovation Challenge. I'm just going to do a little bit of a kind of run through of the agenda for today, as well as a bit of housekeeping before we get into things. But just wanted to say, first of all, that this is the second in a series of webinars. Last week we did an introductory briefing which gave a lot more detail about the kind of aspirations and ambitions of the Prison Leavers Innovation Challenge, as well as more detail about the background and the context, as well as the challenge statements themselves. So if you haven't seen that already, I'd really recommend that you watch the recording, which is now available on the Prison Leavers Innovation Challenge website. And we've also published a kind of full FAQ that came out of that event. So really good place to start if you haven't watched that already. So in terms of the agenda for today, we are going to do a bit of a summary of the kind of criteria for applicants in terms of what we will be assessing you on. But the bulk of the event will be an introduction to evaluation, led by our analysts Henry and Phoebe, who I'll be introducing in a second. And so the reason we are doing this is because if you attended our last webinar, you'll know that evaluation is kind of something that's really important for the project. We're really keen to be able to demonstrate the impact of any interventions that we fund. And so this is really a chance to hear about what we're doing in terms of evaluation, what that means for you as applicants, and the support and opportunities that will be available to you if you are successful. We will also talk through a bit more detail the kind of evaluability criteria, and then there will be a chance for questions at the end. It's also worth just saying now that there will be an additional webinar next week on the 27th, which will be more of a deep dive into the prison leaver journey and the kind of research that went into developing the challenge statements. So if you haven't signed up to that already, I'd recommend that you do that. We will be sending round details after this event of any upcoming events, as well as the slides that we're using here and FAQs. We will also be sharing a link to a web form to opt in to share your details with other possible applicants. This is completely optional, but this is just something that has come up from a few interested suppliers that they'd like the chance to connect to and network with other suppliers. So if you're interested in that, you can just give your consent to share details when we send that round. So please do that if you want to, but no obligation. And last thing just to say, we will be doing a Q&A at the end, as I say, but please do pop your questions in throughout the event and we will get to them at the end. We'll try and answer as many as possible, and we will also publish all of the responses on the website afterwards, so they will be available to all. Right, so if we just move into the slides. So as I say, there was a full briefing webinar last week, which introduced the programme in more detail. So I'm not going to go into this in any detail now, but just to recap, the Prison Leavers Project is a £20 million cross-sector programme that looks at new ways so sorry, everybody. My computer decided to do an update then. If you're still with me, I'll just pick up where I left off there. So the Prison Leavers programme is a £20 million cross-sector programme that looks at piloting new ways to tackle reoffending. We think of ourselves as the innovation hub of the reducing reoffending strategy, in that we're all about kind of testing and experimenting new ideas at a small scale to understand what works, with a view to scaling up the approaches that prove to be most effective. There are 3 strands to the project. If I could just have the next slide, please. There are three strands to the project. So the first is our cross-sector service communities, which are teams staffed from across the system, so local authorities, other government departments, third sector, and so on, who are coming together to build and develop pilots across a range of different themes. There is also our Local Leadership and Integration Grant Fund, which is a fund available to local leaders and agencies to improve join-up of services in their local area. And that launched earlier this year. And then there is the Innovation Challenge, which is the strand of the programme where we want to inject tech sector expertise and innovation into this policy space. And we're really, really excited to see what the tech sector can bring to these challenges. So that's a very brief overview of the project. Like I say, please do visit the other webinar for more information on that. Before I hand over to the evaluation team, I'm just going to really quickly run through the other criteria that we will be assessing applicants on. So this is taken from the supplier guidance, which is on the website. So hopefully some of you have seen this before, but just to run through, the criteria. So as you can see, the kind of biggest weighted criteria is the top there, 30% for projected impact. And what we're really looking for here is kind of your proposal for how your solution might kind of improve outcomes that are linked to reducing reoffending. So I'd recommend you look at the additional supplier context pack, which sets out the outcomes that we're really interested in here. But what we want to understand is kind of what value you think your solution can bring, both on those outcomes, but also potentially return on investment and long-term savings, as well as potential for scale. The second is solution feasibility. So here we're really interested in hearing your proposal for how you will build a prototype, as well as any kind of associated costs and potentially any kind of risks and mitigations that you are planning for when developing that prototype. The third is measurability. This is the kind of evaluation bit that Henry will be talking about in more detail, so I won't go into that now, but just to say, as you can see, this is worth 20%. So while this is really important to us, it is not the only thing that is important to us in terms of assessment. The fourth is skills and experience. So obviously we're really keen to understand that you have the necessary capability to build and deploy and roll out your product, and preferably have some kind of experience in working on similar kind of complex projects. And the fifth and final is the price. And so this is fairly self-explanatory in that the supplier with the kind of lowest price will be awarded the highest percentage of marks there. So hopefully that all makes sense, but if you have any questions, like I said, we can come to those at the end. But for now, I'm just going to hand over to Henry, who will introduce the kind of evaluation strand of the project.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Henry Davidson. I lead a team of analysts within the Prison Lever project. So we provide analytical support for the whole project and also oversee the evaluation of the project. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, evaluation and learning are a really key element of the Prison Lever project. So our aim is to make sure that all projects are really driven by the evidence and also really robustly evaluated. So as well as specifically focusing on the criteria that relates to the evaluation, which Phoebe's going to come on to later, and how to complete these sections in the best way, I'm also going to give some contextual information about the actual evaluation of the project itself. But before I do that, I'm conscious that there might be different levels of experience of evaluation. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the basics of evaluation before going on to the more specifics. So we go to thank you. So in terms of the introduction to evaluation, so I've got three questions here. So what is evaluation? Why do we evaluate? And when to evaluate? So in terms of the what, very simply, evaluation is assessing whether and how something has worked, both in the sense of how effectively something has been delivered, but also whether it had the impact that it intended to. So different types of evaluation allow you to understand what works in practice for whom and in what context, as well as looking at whether the costs of a project justify the benefits that are produced by a project. So that's the what. In terms of the why, obviously evaluations provide us with evidence to inform decisions on whether to continue with a project. And if we do continue with a project, whether and how something can be improved, but really crucially as well, whether to stop a project if it doesn't look like it's producing the benefits that were anticipated. And finally, accountability is really important as well. So the money that we're able to provide for this project is obviously provided by the taxpayer, and it's really important that we're able to be transparent about how that money is used, and then also what benefits are generated from that money. And then finally, when to evaluate. So often people think of evaluation after a project, so looking back and thinking what impact did the project have. But it's really important that we think about evaluation before a project and during a project as well. So in terms of the before, we try and think about evaluation as we're actually designing interventions. So making sure that it's designed in a way which helps us to evaluate it, and thinking about things like baseline measures. So looking at data before individuals who've gone through a project, and then after, and comparing that difference over time. And we also evaluate during a project. So that's really thinking about the things of understanding how something's being implemented and delivered as it's live. And then finally, after, so looking at what actual impact the project had on individuals and why it might have had that effect. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So to allow us to look at these questions, we have different kinds of evaluation which we can use. So key types of process evaluations, outcome and impact evaluations, and economic evaluations. So process evaluations are looking at what can be learned from how an intervention was delivered. So answering questions around the implementation and operation of a program. So they might be looking at things like, was an intervention implemented as it was intended to? What worked well about a project and why? And what can we learn moving forward about how that project was delivered? So process evaluations often use a lot of qualitative methods, so things like interviews and focus groups, and often speaking to a lot of different people who are involved in that project. So people actually delivering a project, but also people who had delivered to, such as prison leavers in this example. And often process evaluations will be conducted at various different time points to understand how things are changing over time. And then in terms of outcome and impact evaluations, that's trying to understand what difference an intervention has made. So really thinking about whether a policy or an intervention has achieved its intended outcomes, and really crucially, whether the project itself was the actual cause in a change in outcomes. So actually proving this cause and effect is often really challenging. And the robust way of doing that is to understand what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. We call that the counterfactual. And so one way of isolating the effects of the project is to have something called a comparison or control group. And what we do after a project is compare the outcomes of those who received the intervention, so that's maybe called the treatment group, and the outcomes of those who didn't receive the intervention, the control group, but who are very similar in terms of their characteristics to the people who did receive the intervention. And what that allows us to do is look at the difference between the two outcomes to help us to determine the impact the project itself had, rather than other external factors. So with outcome and impact evaluations, they're primarily looking at quantitative methods, data and numbers. And often we're trying to use data that's already routinely collected to help make sure it's not too burdensome and collecting lots of new primary data if data is available. And finally, we've got economic evaluations as well. So looking at whether an intervention is a good use of resource. So trying to see what costs were put into a project and then quantifying and monetizing the benefits that were produced. For example, monetizing a reduction in reoffending, and then weighing up the two to see if the costs justify, the benefits justify the costs. So we can now move on to the next slide. So that's a bit of an intro about of what evaluation is, why we do it. I'm now going to talk a bit about the actual evaluation of the Prison Leaver project itself. So in the Prison Leaver project, we're evaluating at 3 separate levels. So that bottom level, we're evaluating the different interventions that are developed and funded through the various elements of the Prison Leaver project. So linking back to those process and impact evaluation elements, we're trying to think about whether a project or intervention had the desired impact that it set out to in terms of social inclusion and other outcomes for prison leavers, but also what works in terms of how that intervention has been implemented. And I'm trying to understand if something could be upscaled, what would we want to take forward and what would we want to change. And then we're also evaluating at the strand level. So within the Prison Leaver Innovation Challenge, for example, what kind of ways of working have been effective? What's worked well in terms of the challenge statements that we could then take forward in future? So we'll also be working with organisations around that. And then finally bringing that all together to have a look at the overarching programme, what effect has that had? So we can now move on to the next slide. So refocusing this back on the process, impact and economic evaluations that I talked about earlier. So we're going to be looking at using all three of these tools as part of the overarching project. We, as a central evaluation team, have commissioned out an expert consortium of evaluators. So we're working with Tonic and the University of Kent to actually conduct the evaluation. And so we're working with an external organisation for a couple of reasons. So one being that to add that extra element of expertise, particularly around these different elements of the evaluation, but also objectivity as well, making sure we have an external partner who can really robustly assess the impact that the project had. So I think really crucially is what this doesn't mean is that we can be very distant from the evaluation of different interventions within the project. So any projects that are funded through the Prison Leaver project, through the PLIC, we're going to be working really closely with to make sure that the kind of evaluation that we're doing works well for the teams actually delivering interventions, as well as working well for us. And what we're really going to be doing is building in feedback loops into the project. So the things that we're learning as part of the evaluation can be fed back into teams delivering to help to improve their interventions. So in terms of the process evaluation, what this will mean is we'll be speaking to teams actually delivering interventions, as well as prison leavers, frontline staff, and others as well. And we'll be conducting this at several time points through the delivery of the interventions. In terms of the impact evaluations, what we're primarily going to be using is data sets that are held centrally within the Ministry of Justice, that we're able to look at all the outcomes of all prison leavers, essentially. So if a prison leaver leaves prison, we're able to see whether that prison leaver reoffended or was able to secure employment or accommodation. But we'll also hopefully be working with project teams that are delivering to see what data they can collect on the ground as well. And what we'll be doing as well is trying to establish control groups, as I talked about earlier. Now we're able to do this in a few different ways, as Phoebe will come into later. But one way we're able to do that is using those central data sets to look for outcomes in the control group as well. And we'll be doing that, although building evaluation in as we go through, we're actually going to be conducting that after the delivery of the interventions to make sure we see what impact has after time. And that will be two separate time points as well. And then finally, economic evaluation as well. So using project costs that are spent as part of the project. And as I said earlier, monetizing benefits, things like reoffending, to look at that difference. So in terms of what that will look like for interventions that are funded, all interventions will receive some form of evaluation. So qualitative process interviews with the actual project teams delivering those interventions at three separate time points. So one, as we're thinking about building up the intervention, and then two, actually during that delivery, as well as monitoring outcomes data that for specific projects, the kind of outcomes that they're going to be delivering. But some projects will lend themselves better to potentially more in-depth qualitative fieldwork. So we'll be doing some of this with certain projects. So delving more into speaking to prison leavers and frontline staff, prison and probation staff, potentially. And some interventions will lend themselves more to a robust impact evaluation, ones with particularly large sample sizes, so that's individuals going through an intervention, and ones where we can establish a really robust control group. Again, Phoebe will come on to some of that in more detail. We can now move on to the next slide. So when we're talking about outcomes, we within the Prison Leaver project have identified specific outcomes that we're trying to drive forward and deliver as part of the project as a whole. So reducing reoffending for individuals, making sure people get into employment, things around family and mental health, and data sets that we have centrally within the Ministry of Justice and other departments allow us to actually measure some of these outcomes quite well. So we won't go into too much detail on this slide, but an example is around accommodation. So one of the things we're trying to achieve through the project is making sure that prison leavers get safe and secure accommodation. And using our central data sources, we're able to look to see whether on release someone actually had accommodation. We can see that for all prison leavers, but also whether they are in accommodation 3 months after release as well. So we can now go on to the next slide. But for some of those outcomes that we're aiming to achieve, we don't have central data sources to be able to measure those things. So particularly around health outcomes, but also family relationships and individuals' perceptions of themselves, we don't have central data sources to look at those. So what we're hoping to do is work with organisations delivering these things to see whether we can collect data in these areas. And again, Phoebe will come on to this in more detail. So finally, just in my section, final slide for me. So to enable us to access these data sources for individuals, we need certain details on individuals who are being delivered to. So again, more on this is included in your pack. There are certain unique identifiers like a PNC number, for example, which is just a police national computer number, which allows us to see whether an individual leaving prison has reoffended, and things like the severity of that reoffence and the time to reoffence, as well as something called a DELIUS number, allows us to look at the accommodation and employment numbers. And these are all things which are routinely collected by prison and probation staff. So I'm now going to hand over to Phoebe to talk about more about what this specifically means for successful applicants and also how to build your application as well.
Thank you, Henry. Hi, everyone. As Henry said, my name is Phoebe, and I'm one of the analysts within the MOJ evaluation team. So for the next part of this webinar, I wanted to kind of cover two key parts. So firstly, briefly discuss how successful candidates will work with us, and then move on to what we're going to be looking for from bidders at the application stage, and mainly discuss how you can get the top marks in the evaluation section. So firstly, looking at how you're going to be working with the internal MOJ team. So a key requirement of successful bidders will be that you collect and then provide us with data on the specific individuals that you're delivering your intervention to. Now, we need this information for two reasons. So firstly, so we can demonstrate, so we can determine who you've reached and look at key information like their demographics. And that's not only for ourselves in the evaluation, but also to be able to report back to the funders of this work. Secondly, so we can link individuals to our administrative data sets that Henry has mentioned. We require unique identifiers, and this means names, date of births, but also things like prison record numbers. So the specifics of exactly what data you need to collect are largely going to depend on your intervention. So for example, if one element of your intervention is a course provided to prison leavers, there might be two aspects of data that you want to collect. So the first might be the collection of personal identifiers for everyone who signs up to the app. But the second part might be to look at the level of engagement for individuals, so how much of the course each individual has completed. So please remember, and I'll keep saying this throughout the presentation, but we'll be working very closely with every organisation that gets through to the next phase. We'll help you explore what information might be useful to collect, and we'll make sure that this process of collection is as robust as it can be. All we're looking for at the application stage is just to see evidence that you've thought about how you could collect some of this information. So once you've collected all this data, we'd then be looking to have regular conversations with you on the accuracy and the reliability of this data. And this is so we as a team can kind of make informed decisions of how best to use that data in the evaluation. So next, looking at how you'll be able to work with our external evaluation partners. So the main ways you'll be working with the University of Kent and Tonic is by helping them to conduct a process evaluation. And this is mainly going to involve making your staff available for interviews to discuss lessons learned around how well the delivery is going. But it'll also require you to act as a gatekeeper for similar discussions to take place with prison leavers or anyone else involved in your intervention. These discussions, as Henry's already mentioned, are likely to take place at 3 time points. So before you start the delivery, around 3 months after the delivery has begun, and towards the end of your delivery. And now it's important to note that every successful intervention that is funded at stage 2 will receive some form of qualitative evaluation. However, some are going to receive more than others, and this will depend on several factors. For example, the range of individuals involved in your intervention and our ability to collect high quality quantitative data around your intervention. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now I'd like to move on to what we'll be looking for at the application stage, and really how you can demonstrate to us that your proposed intervention can meet all of our evaluation requirements. Applicants are likely to score very highly if they can demonstrate they've thought about 3 key elements, and I will go into these in much more detail on the next slide. But briefly, we want a clearly defined user group for your intervention, as well as consideration of a control group, which I'll come on to in a minute. Next, we want to understand which measurable outcomes linked to reoffending you're hoping to improve with your intervention, as well as any of the currently unmeasurable outcomes that Henry's already mentioned. Finally, we want you to think about how you're going to measure these outcomes for your user group and ideally also your control group. So next slide, please. Now, we can think about some of these elements within something called the PICO framework, where we're asking you to think about 4 things. So your population, your intervention, your comparison groups, and then finally your outcome. You're going to score really, really highly in the evaluation section if you can show us that you've tried to think about each of these elements. So firstly, looking at population, you need to be as clear as possible about who your intervention will be targeting. Will you be targeting a specific subgroup, for example, perhaps a specific age range or gender or sentence length? And this really comes down to who you think is most suitable for this intervention. You also need to think about how you're going to be able to collect data on the individuals who are involved. So in the guidelines, we've given you a list of data points you'll be required to collect, and this includes things like PNC and NOMIS numbers, as well as names, ages, and release dates. And you'll likely find that the easiest and most robust way of collecting some of this information is directly from the prison or probation staff. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the intervention aspect of this because it will be largely covered by other sections of the application, but I do want to speak a little bit about the comparator, as this is something that it can be difficult to get your head around, especially in this space. So simply put, this section is about how we make sure the changes we are seeing are because of your intervention and not something else going on in the system. And to do this, as Henry's mentioned, we need something to compare your intervention to. In other words, what would have happened if your intervention didn't happen? And we refer to this as the counterfactual. Ideally, what we want to do is establish a clear control group. We want a group of people who are as similar as possible to your target population, with the only difference being that they didn't receive the intervention. What we can then do is compare outcomes between the 2 groups. And when we look at this comparison, we're then really able to understand what impact we can attribute specifically to your intervention. Now, a common way of creating a control group is through randomization, and we refer to this as a randomized control trial. For example, if there's 2,000 individuals eligible to receive your intervention, 1,000 of these would be randomly assigned to your intervention group, with the other 1,000 placed into your control group who wouldn't receive the intervention. Now, if we look at this for an intervention that included a course delivered through an app, for example, 2,000 people would be referred to and then sign up to your app. Then, on sign up, the app would randomly place the individuals either in the control or in the intervention group. And in the best case scenario, your app would continue to collect data from both groups. So, however, while randomized controlled trials might be considered the gold standard in evaluation, we do understand that these aren't always possible for a range of reasons, and that's entirely okay. In these cases, what we need to do is look for something called a quasi-experimental design. And for this, we'd want to find a similar group to your target user group, perhaps a similar prison of a similar age that we could compare outcomes with. Now, at the application stage, we're looking for applicants to propose what might make a good control group, either through randomization or by identifying a comparable group of people. Now, one final thing I wanted to raise around the control groups is the difficulty that occurs when there's a qualitative or subjective assessment of who might be in your intervention group. This is detailed within the SME packs, but it's quite important, so I did want to raise it here again. Now, I want to give the example of a prison officer referring individuals to your intervention. Instead of being able to follow strict criteria defined by age, gender, or similar information, the prison officer is making a subjective assessment of who to refer, and this is based on their perceptions of whether or not they think the individual requires it. Now, while this might seem entirely acceptable, in this situation, it becomes incredibly difficult for us to create a control group because we can't then replicate this exact process with the same prison officer in a different prison, for example. So please, as you are starting to think about the evaluation of your intervention, do keep this in mind. Now, with the control groups, we do appreciate a lot of this might sound a bit difficult to get your head around, but just to reiterate, we are going to be working with successful applicants to develop this further. We are not in any way, shape or form expecting perfection at the application stage. So the final element of the PICO is the outcomes. So for this, you need to be clear about what outcomes your intervention intends to achieve and indicate how these are going to be measured. We're expecting bidders to target some of the outcomes we're trying to improve as part of the overarching Prison Levers project. And we've divided this into two lists that Henry's already shown. Ones that are measurable by our centrally held existing data sets and ones that we are currently unable to measure. We're expecting bidders to identify which of these outcomes they intend to deliver on and detail how they are going to measure these. And notably for the outcomes on the unmeasurable list, you need to propose ways of measuring these outcomes for your users, and ideally also for the control group. All right, next slide, please. So, now we can see some of these elements reflected quite clearly in the scoring criteria for the evaluation. So to get top marks, we will be looking for whether you have a defined user group, that you have thought about building in that control element, either through randomization or through a comparison group, that you've thought about collecting required data from your intervention group, and that you've considered the collection of additional metrics that might be relevant to your intervention. As an absolute minimum to fulfill this part of the criteria, you need to have two things. So a clearly defined user group and also a set out plan of how you'll be able to collect most of those required data points. We do completely appreciate a lot of this might be difficult to work out. We're not saying that if you can't meet all the criteria in the PICO framework that you have no chance. What we are trying to say is that the more thought you can put into this now, the better. But again, please keep in mind we will be working very closely with successful bidders to help you refine this. Okay, next slide, please. So just to give you a quick example of what this might look like. So I have tried to use the example here of a course within an app. that will support prison leavers in finding and retaining suitable accommodation. And then I've matched this to the PICO framework to demonstrate the types of information the evaluation team are going to be looking for. So first of all, we've got a clearly defined population that's based on quantifiable information. We're not relying on a subjective referral process. And we can collect information on these individuals through their probation officer. The other thing to note here is the sample size. So we've said a minimum of at least 100 in our user group, but ideally we'd want to see over 500. And this is really important for the quantitative element of the evaluation. We know what our intervention is, and that's clearly articulated in other elements of the application. We're ideally going to be running a randomised control trial with individuals being randomly assigned to either a control or an intervention group. If not, we have the option of using a comparable location. Finally, we've identified measurable outcomes our intervention will impact, and this includes outcomes from the measurable outcomes list, but also some additional outcomes of interest that we're going to collect data on. And we've detailed how both will be collected at multiple time points and how that is built into our intervention. Okay, next slide. So I hope that that has been useful. I want to stress that the evaluation aspect of the Innovation Challenge will give you a long-term benefit. And thinking about these elements early on is really important. The more you think about this, the more that we can work with you to ensure that you get a really, really robust evaluation. And this is going to help you demonstrate the effectiveness of your intervention. And hopefully this will support you with future procurements as well. We're not, I repeat, not expecting a perfect finished evaluation strategy at this stage. We are simply looking for evidence that you try to find your starting point, so point A on this slide, and then we can help support successful applicants in stage 1 to move forward to point B. So that is everything from me. You can find all of this information and further application support on the website. We're now going to move into the Q&A section of the webinar to answer any specific questions you had on the evaluation. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarika. I'm a program manager with PLIC, which is the organization that is helping to run this alongside the Ministry of Justice. We're moving into our Q&A period now. We have had people sending them in throughout, but I obviously encourage you to still continue. We have had some program related questions as well. As Sarah mentioned previously, we have run this is our second webinar in a set of 3. Our initial one did cover a lot of the program related questions. So we're going to show priority to the evaluation based questions for this session. And then if we have time later, we might answer a few of those, but all those answers have been published, both in the video that we published of the last session, but also in the FAQ section of the UK Gov guidance page. So we're going to move in. I will ask everyone when just to reintroduce themselves quickly as we go around. Sarah, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, and then Alex, and then Henry, and then I'll direct the first question.
Yeah, so I'm Sarah Wilson, and I'm the policy lead at the Ministry of Justice for the Innovation Challenge.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex Stevens. I'm Professor in Criminal Justice at the University of Kent, and we're working with Tonic, which is a private sector consultancy, on the evaluation, both qualitative and quantitative, of the Prison Leaver project, including this strand of it. I'm particularly leading on the quantitative side of that evaluation.
Hi again, everyone. I'm Henry Davidson. I lead the analytical team within the Prison Leaver project at the Ministry of Justice.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so first question then is to Sarah. So this relates to the slide that you showed at the beginning, just showing the different criteria that people will be evaluated on. And someone asked, on the price evaluation, the 10%, does that mean that 10% is awarded to the lowest price bidder and nothing to anybody else? Could you maybe go into slightly more detail on that, please?
Yes, and sorry if I have confused people with that. I'd recommend that you check out the supplier guidance, which is on the website, but just to clarify, no, it doesn't mean that. It means that the maximum marks will be awarded to the supplier with the lowest price, so that they will get 10%, and then the remaining suppliers will receive marks on a kind of pro rata basis from the lowest to the highest. And long-term costs and savings will be considered separately in the kind of feasibility and impact sections. So I hope that makes sense. But as I say, please check out the guidance.
Perfect. And then question 2 is to Henry. So 12 months may not be long enough to fully evaluate a project. What if it takes longer to show its full impact? For example, if a prison leaver gets a job as a result of the project, how long would they need to be employed before it's deemed a success?
Yeah, so really good question. So so the 12 months is the project actually being delivered. And we're then going to be evaluating for, I believe it's around 2 years after the interventions have finished. So we can look to see those outcomes actually materialized. So we're doing a shorter time point at around the 1 year mark, where we'll be looking at things like those accommodation outcomes I mentioned and employment. So, for example, on the employment side, we're looking at employment after 6 weeks and employment after 6 months after the intervention. So we allow that period of time for those outcomes to materialise. And on the reoffending one, what we frequently look at in the Ministry of Justice is reoffending after 1 year. So again, we need quite a lot of time to see those outcomes materialise.
Fantastic, thank you, Henry. And then our third question is for Sarah. So we had someone ask, can we pilot and further develop a prototype that has already started but not yet gone live?
New solutions. So a kind of off-the-shelf prototype wouldn't be accepted unless you could demonstrate that you'd made kind of adaptations or kind of further develop the pilot so that it was specifically targeted towards your prison leaver cohort. So yes, it has to be a new product, system or platform, but you can develop an existing intervention as long as it is targeted towards our user group.
Fantastic, thank you. Question 4 then is for Henry. How should suppliers identify the user group for their solution?
So organisations can do this in a number of ways. I think one of the ways is looking at the additional context that we're providing around these challenges, and also the webinar next week looking at the prison leaver journey, and then thinking about their intervention and who it might be best placed to deliver to. So, for example, if something might be linking people to mental health services, then the target group might be specifically people with mental health needs, for example. And organisations are also very welcome to talk to other organisations operating in this space, maybe in the third sector, who might have specific expertise on who specific interventions might be best placed to be delivered to.
Fantastic, thank you, Henry. Okay, so then question 6, and also I apologize, I think we've lost Alex. He's just having some technical issues, but luckily Henry and Sarah are more than adept at answering any questions, and we will publish all answers as well on the website, so no one needs to fear. So question 6 then for Henry as well, which is, why do solutions need to collect the required data?
So there's 2 elements to this, I guess. One is the base data around individuals who are actually part of an intervention, and ultimately we will need to know who is actually being delivered to as part of an intervention, so we can see the impact on those individuals. And the organisations delivering those interventions will be the ones who know who they're delivering to, and we won't be able to know that. So that's an element in terms of that base level data. And in terms of additional data on other metrics that we spoke about. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't have central data sources to cover everything, and we only have a certain amount of resource. And we're aware that local organisations and SMEs might be particularly able to collect certain types of data that we haven't maybe thought of, or might not have the capabilities to do.
Fantastic, thank you, Henry. All right, we are getting lots of questions in, and as we've said, we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So in terms of then, the next question is for Sarah. Is there a particular preference that you're looking for in terms of kind of user groups, control groups, i.e. female, male, juvenile offenders? Is there a set criteria?
Yeah, so the research that we did into our challenge statements was based on the adult male cohort. And so we are predominantly looking for interventions that target adult males. We are open to solutions that are also applicable to female offenders. However, it's worth saying that they have very different needs. And so it would have to be a solution that could be applicable to both rather than specifically female offenders. Juvenile offenders are out of scope. It's also worth saying that, as Phoebe said, we are kind of interested in the specific kind of measurable user group within that cohort. So, for example, certain sentence types, offences, other kind of demographic population type information within the adult male cohort.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we had a few questions in around that, so hopefully that has answered, but as I mentioned, we will publish those. Okay, so then Henry, with quite a short and succinct one, what is TONIC?
So I think Alex actually just mentioned briefly in his intro, but TONIC is a consultancy and social research company who are joining up with the University of Kent to form a consortium to help us on the evaluation.
Perfect. And then Sarah, going back to you then. So there was a question, which is, are you proposing that the solution intervention for PLIC specifically has to be digital?
Yes, so we are looking at digital and technological solutions only. However, worth saying kind of interventions should consider how they will work with other kind of services and systems. But yes, we're looking for tech and digital solutions.
Fantastic. And then one for you again, Sarah, which is that someone asked that they read in the guidance on the website. Thank you very much for reading the documents. Someone did their homework. That collaboration, or what we often refer to as a consortium, is okay. So i.e. companies can come together for this project as long as the lead company is compliant. So does the evaluation look differently or poorly on multi-company applications, or how is that kind of incorporated?
No, there's no preference either way. The reason we are kind of allowing consortia is just because we think it might help certain organisations, depending on their skill set, to kind of further develop their applications, but there will be no kind of preference either way for single organisations or multi-company applications, so long as the criteria are met by the lead company.
Perfect. And we did have a similar one from Emma, which was, would you be expecting the lead to be a digital or a tech agency, or are you happy if a collaboration of a third sector agency lead who already work with prison leavers with a digital partner? I think you've probably slightly answered that, but if you wouldn't mind just reframing.
Yeah, I think there's no restrictions on who can be the lead organisation, just so long as they meet the kind of compliant criteria. So yeah, either way is fine.
Fantastic, thank you. So then question 11 is, so this is for Sarah or myself. So would you be oh, sorry, I'm afraid we just did that one. Apologies, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're just too fast. So the next question then is for Henry, which is, do you imagine that NDELIUS, Prison Nomis and the PNC could be made available APIs to support the supply of data to these applications? I hope that makes sense to you. I'm afraid that's over my remit of technical understanding. But do you imagine something else? I think they're asking kind of around the data collection.
So I'm not entirely sure I understood the question, but if it's in terms of providing data from those systems as part of the application, I'm not sure we'll be able to do that as part of the application process. But I think what we might be able to do is, as we move forward into the phases and getting into the prototyping phase, we can then work with organisations to show data and where to help look at where interventions might be particularly useful or applicable. But I think we were able to do that in the application phase. And sorry if I've misunderstood the question.
So we have had the person came back, and you nailed it, Henry. They said yes, it was around data collection. So thank you for being a bit more clear on that. Next question is an open one. So there's a high focus here on data collection, which absolutely there is. That's why we wanted to run this webinar, to try and make it as clear as possible. And hence there's a potential to possibly make data collection difficult for people involved in the process. So I suppose they're asking, are we right to assume that we're interested in pragmatic attempts to maximize the value of a given amount of data that is collected?
So yeah, so I think that's partly why we did this webinar. As we appreciate it might be a particularly tricky thing, and although we've set out what will be fantastic in terms of collecting additional data on other outcomes and that kind of thing, I think as Phoebe spoke about quite a bit, we really want to work really closely with organisations that get through these stages to see what is possible for each organisation. As I mentioned, at that base level, we do need to know who has been involved in interventions so we can assess the impact. But things beyond that, we'll be working with organisations to make sure it's not overly burdensome on them.
Okay, fantastic. We seem to be getting through the questions quite quickly, so I'd say we're coming to the end of the ones that have come in. We have had a few people ask just in terms of if the slides and resources will be made available. So yes, the slides will be published on the Gov page. We're also hoping ideally that a recording of this session should also be uploaded. There is the recording of last week's session available as well. And then also in terms of any questions that may not have been answered, although I believe we have gotten to most of them, will be published on the FAQ section of the guidance page. And there is also a form there that if you forgot to ask a specific question, you can send that in there. So I'm just going to have a check to see if we have anything else coming in. And we do. So the term app has been used in several examples. From an innovation point of view, is the assumption here that all prison leavers will have access to a smartphone, data, and/or Wi-Fi? Sarah, would you like to take first steer at this, as I know this is something that we've discussed quite heavily as an organisation in creating this project?
Yes, so it is something we're kind of aware of could be a challenge, and there are obviously prison leavers are at risk of being kind of digitally excluded, and also kind of potentially having lower rates of kind of digital literacy. So that is something that I think we would ask suppliers kind of factor into their proposals. However, the research that we have from the charity Switchback suggests that 4 in 5 prison leavers do have access to a smartphone. So I think we are working on the assumption that many prison leavers do. I also think it's important to note that this is kind of why we test things. This is why we want to kind of build the evidence base and understand what we can do to support prison leavers. So I think through this work we may kind of further understand those kinds of issues. But yes, I think from the perspective of the Prison Leavers Innovation Challenge, we are kind of working on the assumption that most prison leavers will have access to a smartphone, and if not, we want to see interventions kind of think about how else they could kind of build a product or service that could support prison leavers, and to factor in some of those issues around kind of access and literacy in terms of their long-term kind of deliverability, I suppose.
Fantastic. So we're probably going to do 1 or 2 final questions, as we don't seem to have gotten too many in the past couple of minutes. I think people were on the board early. One person did ask just around the budget for this project. So this was shared in previous sessions, just to be clear on it. So there's 2 phases. There's a shortlisting phase and a piloting phase. The shortlisting phase receives up to 25,000 and the piloting phase is up to 350,000. And I think our final question was just asking kind of around different kind of sharing frameworks around information. I know that that's something that once the people who move into the shortlisting phase, the MOJ will be sharing additional information with them. So we can give maybe a small idea around what's included there. But I will say that there is a huge amount of information already on the guidance page. So there's obviously the challenge statements, and there's also the additional challenge context pack. And in there's each challenge broken down into user needs, different types of data, and both measurable and unmeasurable, that Henry provided and that he's also explained a little bit in this session. But Sarah, if you could give maybe just a rough idea of kind of more information that might be shared later down the line. And I understand obviously we can't share everything as it will be very private information for a lot of the users.
Yeah, I think you've kind of covered it really, in that just suppliers who kind of get through to the shortlisting phase will be kind of supported to think about things like data sharing agreements, and we will put in place kind of the necessary documents and guidance and kind of training and information if necessary to support suppliers with that. Fantastic.
Okay, I think that was our last question. So we've rounded out quite nicely towards the hour. I'll ask obviously Sarah and Henry just to kind of give us a small goodbye and round us out, but just remember to please do check all of those documents that we mentioned, because there is a huge amount of information available there, and to submit any questions you may have forgotten in those question forms. But thank you on my side for everyone for joining, and Sarah and Henry, I'll pass the mic to you now as well.
Great, thanks, Eka. Yeah, and just to say thank you very much for attending, and thank you for all of your questions. If there are any that we've not got to, as Eka says, we will provide kind of written responses to them and publish them on the website, and that will be sent round to you afterwards. And just another plug to say there is another webinar next week, which is kind of delving more into actually the kind of issues that prison leavers face and the kind of user journey. So I'd really recommend you join that if you can. But yeah, just thanks again for joining, and speak to you all soon.